Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, hey guys, fun topic. Well, maybe fun's not the right word, but interesting topic. My name's Connor if you're new. Hello. Original link to the video from Political Fronts. Top of the description, another Simon channel. Love me a good Simon video. Sweden's integration problem. So, obviously a video about immigration. I know that to most, this is to be controversial just means a subject. If a subject is controversial, it just means a topic or subject, a subject that has very differing opinions on it, right? I tend to think of controversial as a sort of negative word, right? But in reality, it just means like if there's a sports team that a lot of people like and a lot of people dislike, then that is controversial. So it doesn't have to have a negative connotation, but usually it does, unfortunately. So, but even on subjects like this, I'm going to talk about it like I do any other subject. I'm going to have opinions, and I'm going to say things, I'm going to ask questions, and I want you guys, if you disagree with anything I say, or how I say it, or whatever, let me know. Let me know in the comments, right? But I'm not going to treat this as a subject that is any different than anything else. That's just sort of how I think. So
in October 2023, Swedish police arrested a 14-year-old for conspiracy to commit murder. He'd allegedly been recruited through social media by drug gangs to carry out assassinations. And this wasn't an anomaly. It is something that has grown far too common for European standards. Now, that same year, the country detained multiple children under 15 for weapons offences, attempted murder, and, well, actual assassinations. Sweden, once synonymous with Volvo and Nobel Prizes, now holds a far darker distinction.
That's another thing, is that, like, I live in a country, America, the USA, that has way more problems than Sweden has, right? And so I don't want to make it seem like I think, whoa, Sweden has so many problems. It's just the fact that the world looks at Nordic countries, Northern European countries, like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, these countries as, like, everyone looks to you guys as like good examples of how society can balance certain aspects of society that aren't so balanced around the world, like in the USA. So I'm going to give my opinions, but it's more shocking just because it's in Sweden. Does that make sense?
It is the highest rate of fatal shootings per capita in Europe, with 53 fatal shootings.
Sweden?
In 2023, a number Nobel Prizes now holds a far darker distinction. It is the highest rate of fatal shootings per capita in Europe, with 53 fatal shootings.
This is my point. I'm pausing so much already, but when I'm surprised, like, oh, Sweden? The USA obviously has a way exponentially worse problem with guns and fatal shootings than Sweden. So I don't want you to think like, oh, this guy's from America and he's surprised by these shootings. It's just the fact that it's Sweden that has this problem that makes me so shocked.
In 2023, a number that would have been unthinkable as little as a decade ago. Now, this story's not as simple as immigration bad. For decades, the country successfully integrated waves of Vietnamese, Yugoslav, and Iraqi refugees. What makes Sweden different isn't just the people came, but the specific combination of policies, and perhaps more relevantly, the lack thereof, during the more recent waves. When 163,000 asylum seekers arrived in 2015, Sweden's officials gathered generous support that far outpaced its neighbors, with far less requirements to get them. Let people find their own way. That was the approach they went for. A decade later, though, that hands-off doctrine has produced something few in government at the time saw coming. In neighborhoods where 90% of residents of immigrant backgrounds and youth unemployment hits north of 30%, Swedish teenagers with immigrant parents find themselves caught between two worlds, fully belonging to neither one. The result is parallel societies where Swedish law carries less weight than gang hierarchies, where generous welfare is seen as something to exploit rather than contribute to, and where the civic trust that underpins Nordic society never developed. This is the story of how one of the world's safest and most prosperous societies found itself grappling with unintended consequences, and what it reveals about the complex realities of integration.
Okay.
So to understand how Sweden went from integration success story to cautionary tale, you need to understand what made 2015 different. The Syrian civil war, along with conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, had created the largest forced displacement of people since World War II. Millions fled toward Europe, and Sweden, with its reputation for generosity and existing Middle Eastern diaspora communities, became a prime destination. The numbers were absolutely staggering even by crisis standards. While Germany made international headlines for taking over 1 million refugees, Sweden's
have a way
intake
bigger
was
population.
proportionally far greater.
Yeah.
For a nation of 10 million to accept 163,000 asylum seekers in a single year was the proportional equivalent of Los Angeles taking in the entire population of Palo Alto. While a few other countries came close to matching their intake on a per capita basis, they took first place throughout the continent. This wave also did.
Sorry, guys. How many people do like Norway have? Norway population 5.5. What about Denmark? Lower than I thought. Finland? Iceland? Well, Iceland is Jesus Christ! Iceland isn't a great comparison because it's much more removed than the other ones. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to, just for a reference.
Differed from previous refugee groups, not just in scale, but also in timing and context. When Bosnians fled to Sweden in the 1990s during the Yugoslav wars, they brought industrial work experience from Yugoslavia's manufacturing economy and could tap into established networks from earlier Yugoslav migrants. More importantly, though, Sweden's factories still needed workers and didn't require them to speak the local language fluently. The combination largely worked. Around 50,000 Bosnians achieved over 60% employment, eventually producing doctors, entrepreneurs, and even a cabinet minister. The 2015 arrivals faced a transformed economy, though. The Volvo and Saab factories that once employed Vietnamese and Yugoslav refugees with limited linguistic skills had largely either automated or shuttered entirely. In their place were service sector jobs which needed much higher linguistic skills and a deeper understanding of the unwritten rules of society, how to interact with Swedish customers, navigate workplace hierarchies, and understand unwritten social rules. The 2015
I love your guys' architecture, by the way. I don't want to get too distracted.
navigate workplace hierarchies and understand unwritten social rules.
My dumbass is looking at buildings and not listening. All right.
Linguistic skills and a deeper understanding of the unwritten rules of society, how to interact with Swedish customers, navigate workplace hierarchies, and understand unwritten social rules. The 2015 arrivals brought a mix of backgrounds: Syrian teachers and engineers, Afghan farmers, Iraqi shopkeepers, Somali herders, but even the educated professionals faced a harsh reality. Their degrees often weren't recognized, their professional networks were worthless, and the Swedish job market demanded perfect language skills even for many entry-level positions. Swedish authorities, overwhelmed with the sheer scale of arrivals, began funneling newcomers into Miljonprogrammet, the million-program housing projects built in the 60s and 70s. These concrete blocks on the outskirts of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö were originally celebrated as modern affordable housing for Sweden's working class, but by 2015, they'd become something really rather different. The transformation had begun years earlier, as more migrants from the Balkans and beyond came to the country. Economically mobile native-born Swedes originally from these areas began moving out to newer neighborhoods with nicer amenities. Municipal housing companies, facing tighter budgets and declining political interest in these areas, cut maintenance and development. As is so often the case with declining areas the world over, this trend created something of a death spiral. Those who could move out did move out, resulting in more businesses closing, which sent unemployment higher, and so on and so forth. By the time 2015 refugees arrived, these neighborhoods had experienced decades of underinvestment. A 2020 analysis by Germany's Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation found that this decades-long socio-spatial segregation had created a destructive cocktail of integration problems. By 2015, many of these areas, called vulnerable areas by the Swedish police, had become 80 to 90% immigrant background. Sweden's parliament had officially adopted an integration policy back in 1975 that fundamentally reshaped how the country thought about immigration. Built on three pillars, equality, freedom of choice, and partnership, it deliberately rejected the forced assimilation model used elsewhere. There would be no language tests for citizenship, no civics exams, no expected cultural conformity. Instead, Sweden would support mother tongue instruction in schools, provide interpreters in public services, and extend voting rights to non-citizen residents starting in 1976 after 3 years residence.
Non-citizen residents can vote?
Would support mother tongue instruction in schools, provide interpreters in public services, and extend voting rights to non-citizen residents starting in 1976.
Okay, I don't know really how I feel about that. On one hand, I'm like, wait, you're not a citizen, you shouldn't be able to vote. And on the other hand, if you're there for 3 years, even if you're not a citizen, you're going to be affected by what is voted on, and so maybe you should be able to vote. But the main issue with that is, like, if I'm moving to Sweden, for example, and I've been there for 3 years, but I'm not a citizen, and maybe I'll leave the next year, then should I vote on policies that will affect Swedes who will continue to live in Sweden, even if I'm not committed to living in Sweden? I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm curious to hear what you guys have to think, so I can...
After 3 years residence in the country, the philosophy was based on the thinking that commonality would emerge as a natural result of shared institutions like schools and workplaces, not through coercive requirements. SFI, Swedish for Immigrants, existed and after 3 years residence in the country. The philosophy was based on the thinking that commonality would emerge as a natural result of shared institutions like schools and workplaces, not through coercive requirements. SFI, Swedish for Immigrants, existed and participation in an introductory program, including language training, was officially required, but allowed for nearly anyone to opt out without sacrificing welfare payments. Unsurprisingly, many people did opt out. Now, the combination of
as good as that might seem, like, you don't want to, like, it almost has, like, you might think it has like a racist element. You need to learn Swedish. It shouldn't have a racist element. For one, it's not racist, and for two, you might be hurting them more because you want to feel good in the moment about being like, I don't think they should have to speak Swedish, okay? I'm a righteous person, right? But you're actually going to cripple them. That's what's so maddening, is the people who are acting like they're, like, better than you, but in effect are causing them to be worse off. Because now how are they going to get a job in Sweden if they can't speak Swedish? So you wanting a little good feeling for yourself in the moment is going to screw over entire populations. So, like in everything, there needs to be a balance.
The vast linguistic differences between many migrants' original language and Swedish, combined with strict language requirements for employment, created something...
Exactly. What you just said.
Dependent language and Swedish, combined with strict language requirements for employment,
Yeah, not knowing the language of the country you're trying to get employed in is going to be a problem.
Created something of a dependency system in which migrants were often making more for not working than they would if they learned the local language.
That makes complete sense.
On a job. This apparent contradiction, generous welfare alongside gang recruitment, requires some careful unpacking. Household benefits, especially with housing support and...
I hate that those phrases, like careful unpacking. If you're not racist and you're not this, then just talk about it like any subject. Well, it needs to be dealt with delicately. Well, then you are part of the problem because you're going to make more issues that are already there. I can't stand this. Like, I'm sure a lot of people have good intentions of, like, we don't want to be racist. It's a good thing. You know, we want to, but you getting that short little high of you thinking you're doing good worsens the situation.
Multiple children could indeed unpacking. Household benefits, especially with housing support and multiple children, could indeed equal or exceed entry-level wages, creating work disincentives for adults. But the young men targeted by gangs operated in a different economic reality. Many were teenagers or young adults ineligible for substantial cash support themselves, even if their households received benefits. They faced what economists call high effective marginal tax rates. Taking a minimum wage job could trigger longer benefit tapering for their families while barely improving their personal cash flow. Meanwhile, gang recruitment offered immediate pay with no language requirements, no credential checks, no postal code discrimination. A 15-year-old couldn't access family benefits directly, but could make tens of thousands of krona, sometimes even hundreds of thousands, each month working for the gangs. The money bought more than just material goods too. It bought respect and recognition in communities where that wasn't common. Gang leaders increasingly understood something the welfare system missed entirely. These young men craved purpose and recognition, not just subsistence. Their parents' benefits might keep the lights on and food on the table, but in neighborhoods where traditional paths to success seemed blocked at every turn, drug money offered a seemingly rare route to the top.
100%. Let's say if I were to move to Sweden, or let's say to Turkey, I don't know, pick a country. If I were to move to Turkey and there was a group of American English speakers in Turkey, right, who didn't know the Turkish language but were allowed to live there, got government benefits, and then I moved there to flee problems in my own country, then I'm going to go into that American English-speaking community in Turkey, and then I'm not going to need to learn the Turkish language. I'm going to receive Turkish government benefits, and then when I try to get a job, well, now I don't know Turkish, and now the only way for me to get a reasonable wage is drugs. And so I don't really blame the people. I don't blame the people. Not really blame the people. I don't blame the people for doing this. I blame the government who set up the system that would inevitably, to any thinking person, lead to this. And now I'm trapped. And so
This reality was exacerbated by much of the affordable housing migrants resided in being clustered together in certain areas. In Rinkeby, Tensta, and Husby, Stockholm's northwestern suburbs, demographic change was dramatic, and neighborhoods developed something akin to their own ecosystems, functional but dramatically disconnected from mainstream Swedish society. Now, Swedish social workers reported varying experiences as the
stay hydrated, guys.
Ecosystems, functional but dramatically disconnected from mainstream Swedish society. Now, Swedish social workers reported varying experiences as the migrant population grew. Some communities welcomed them and their help, while others preferred handling problems internally through family networks and religious institutions. This self-reliance wasn't necessarily problematic, but it meant that Swedish authorities had limited visibility into what was happening in these neighborhoods, and that was when trouble really started brewing. Most concerning were the reports from the police. They increasingly described neighborhoods where tensions would erupt into open clashes, requiring careful policing and at times group patrols for officer safety. These weren't quite the no-go zones that some would have you believe, but they weren't exactly yes-go zones either. By 2019, Swedish police had identified no fewer than 60 of these so-called vulnerable areas across the country, neighborhoods classified by elevated crime rates and social exclusion that made policing more difficult though not impossible. In the partially vulnerable areas, and no, the Swedes aren't winning any awards for their...
By the way, America has many of these places where you have many communities and neighborhoods where it's more dangerous, and that means police don't want to go there as often to risk their life. And that leads to more activity, making it more dangerous. And then police want to go there less, leading to more. It's like a loop, you know?
Possible. In the partially vulnerable areas, and no, the Swedes aren't winning any awards for their naming criteria here, parallel power structures began emerging with less and less of a role for the state. When disputes arose between families, for instance, traditional elders often mediated instead of courts, with religious councils gaining semi-legitimate status in the eyes of many locals, both in terms of establishing behavioral norms and being trustworthy authorities in case of trouble. Most significantly, though, was the dominant economic force that criminal gangs began to gain for many young men who saw little future in the more official society outside their enclaves. Their impact was felt powerfully. The concentration of violence in such areas was dramatically higher than elsewhere in the country. Shootings alone were 9 times higher than in other neighborhoods. The signs were flashing red really quite early, and perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, we can say they should have been seen earlier. But mainstream politicians feared that acknowledging the increasingly
I would say they should have been seen before anything even started.
visible problems would validate the anti-immigration Sweden Democrats.
This is another thing, is that Okay, Jesus Christ. All right.
who were steadily gaining ground since entering Parliament in 2010. The reaction was striking. Mainstream parties completely froze out the Sweden Democrats throughout the 2010s, refusing to work with them or even acknowledge their policy proposals, even as voter concerns about integration mounted. The December Agreement of 2014, crafted by 6 parties explicitly to lock the Sweden Democrats out of budget influence, symbolized this approach. Justice Minister Morgan Johansson pointed to long-term crime statistics to downplay concerns about rising gang violence, drawing criticism from opponents who accused him of ignoring emerging problems, particularly after going on record as saying innocent people had little risk of being hit. While the Social Democrats
Excuse me? Well, that's reassuring. Hey, there's a problem with violence. I'm kind of afraid for my own safety. Don't worry. You're probably not going to get shot. Oh, I feel so much better now.
saying innocent people had little risk of
Before anyone says, you live in America, why are you talking? I know that. I'm not trying to compare where I live as if it's better than here, okay? I shouldn't have to say that, but I'm going
being
to.
hit. While the Social Democrats began tightening migration policies after the 2015 crisis with ID checks and temporary restrictions, the impact remained minimal, and their public rhetoric remained in line with past integration policies. Amidst this growing sentiment, condemning the Sweden Democrats was a priority for many of the more mainstream parties. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven warned of dark forces mobilizing in Sweden during the 2018 election, a clear reference to the party's growing influence. This reflexive rejection reflected something deeper in Sweden's post-war identity. Like much of Western Europe, the country had spent decades constructing a self-image defined as being the alternative to the authoritarian right movements of the 1930s and 40s. The country's official neutrality during World War II and then the Cold War evolved into a moral commitment to humanitarian values, part of how Swedes understood themselves. For mainstream politicians, legitimizing a party with documented far-right, let alone neo-Nazi origins, threatens this entire moral architecture.
I've said this before, and I hate how this happens. So I'm trying to see if I'm like... So this is how humans react, usually, in my experience and learning about stuff, is that when something... So this is where society is good, and then here is where they're bad, right? When society goes bad in this direction, instead of humans usually writing it and going right to here, we usually go here. It's like if we could only just be reasonable when one of the sides goes too far to go here, we have to go here, and then we go here, and then here, 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 and hopefully eventually get to here. If we could only just go, this is correct. But that's just impossible for people to do. And ironically, when you have bad policies and then you see a little bit of right-wing movement or left-wing movement, depending on the scenario, in this situation, you see right-wing movement of like racist people, then you started a loop where it's like, okay, anything that this side of the aisle that right-wing racist movement is on has to be incorrect. And so you side again with this side when certain things in society need you to react to. If any of those things in societal problems are more on the more racist right side, then you're like, no. And that makes you ignore all legitimate problems that have any connection to this side, and you go into this side. And the ironic, scary part is that creates more people going to the far right or far left than you thought. And then it becomes a cycle again to where you just have extreme right and extreme left people. Call out crap that doesn't make sense and stick to it instead of just going to one side or the other.
Democrats were
Anything I say, guys, that you think is wrong, call me out, obviously. I'm one person.
just another conservative party. For many in the country, they represented everything this identity stood against. When established parties signed the December Agreement in 2014 to lock them out of influence, they believed they were protecting Swedish democracy from a serious threat. Yet this moral stance came at a cost. Rather than acknowledging the electorate's legitimate concerns about integration, public safety, and the sheer number of migrants entering the country, the established parties largely insisted that everything was under control, lest they validate the far right's concern.
When you connect a certain issue like immigration to one far right issue, then that means people who aren't racist say something about immigration they're worried about a little, you call them racist. And it's like, no, I'm kind of in the center here, but immigration is racist. No, that's what they say, racist. How about this? I'm going to sound crazy. Whoa, Connor, calm down here. How about this, though? Don't be racist, and also let people in the country who you want to let in. Crazy idea, I know. And if you disagree, let me know, please. But
this denial of obvious problems created a vacuum, one that pushed many otherwise mainstream voters into the hands of a party they likely wouldn't have been attracted to but for lack of alternatives. The perfect storm it had formed. Voters watched violence rising in their communities while established parties seemed more focused on maintaining their quarantine around the Sweden Democrats than solving actual problems. By 2022, this strategy had backfired spectacularly, a pattern by that point which had been echoing throughout the continent, with the party becoming the second largest and serving as kingmakers in the current government. By then, though, the failures of Sweden's hands-off integration experiment were all too clear to see. Among Somali refugees, for example, employment rates were devastating. Just 27% of men and a mere 13% of women had found any work whatsoever after years in the country. This wasn't because they were inherently lazy. Many had run businesses, farms, or worked in various industries back home, where widespread poverty meant idleness resulted in going to bed hungry. But by entering a country without a plan to bring them into society, they were essentially trapped. Meanwhile, Sweden faced labour shortages in exactly the sectors where refugees might have found work. Construction sites sat idle for lack of workers, while young men were sitting idle in suburban apartments. The mismatch was at least partially due to language barriers, but also had to do with the strict identification systems and compliance rules that made hiring migrants an enormous burden. For instance, a Syrian electrician with 20 years of experience couldn't legally touch a wire in Sweden without the proper Swedish certification papers, which could take years to get, even if you'd been in the business since you were 15. Sweden's robust labour protections, the pride of the Nordic model, certainly had their benefits, but while welcoming in so many newcomers, they also became something of a trap. Many refugees found themselves locked out of what employment they were able to do as a result. The result of all of this was thousands of young men with nothing but time, no legitimate future, and growing resentment, something that, with very rare exceptions throughout history, has been a recipe for disaster across all cultures, all races, and all of the continents. Now, we don't want to simply imply that the government in Stockholm was doing nothing. Sweden did have some integration infrastructure. The introduction program from 2010 officially tied benefits to participation in language classes called Swedish for Immigrants and civic orientation. On paper, missing activities could trigger warnings or even payment suspensions, but enforcement revealed the gap between Swedish policy and practice. Government audits found that sanctions were rarely applied even when participants failed to show up. The Swedish Unemployment Insurance Inspectorate documented, quote, deficiencies in how sanctions were handled, while a 2024 audit noted that few people have received a sanction despite widespread non-compliance. Local officers varied wildly in follow-up, with some strictly enforcing the rules while others essentially ignoring them. More importantly, even those who lost introduction benefits could still access other support, municipal social assistance, child allowances, housing allowances, none of which required language participation. The result was that many long-term residents with minimal Swedish continued receiving substantial benefits through alternative channels. Only 12 to 28% of introduction program participants found employment after completing it, according to government audits, yet the various benefit streams kept on flowing. While these integration challenges played out across Swedish society, a separate crisis was brewing in the criminal underworld. The established gangs that had controlled drug trafficking and organized crime for decades were about to face a massive disruption, one that would...
And this is the thing, that initially something as simple as asking immigrants to learn Swedish, many people who had good intentions, I'm sure, would be like, no, they shouldn't have to. But then you create a scenario where they can't prosper as much as other Swedish citizens, and therefore have to go into other means of getting money and their own identity, which then leads to statistics that people on the far right can use in many to do something. And so by your initial good intention thing, you made it way worse.
transformed Swedish crime from a rare phenomena into
I feel like I'm repeating myself.
something far more chaotic and far more violent. The year 2020 marked a turning point in many countries in many ways, and usually not in the way anyone expected. Sweden was no exception, although the way their year played out was perhaps even more unique than others. While the rest of the world battled lockdown and virus variants, Sweden's streets erupted into unprecedented gang warfare. The old rules of organized crime, codes about not targeting families, avoiding public shootings, minimizing civilian harm, they died as a new generation took control. Now, as you've covered on our sister channel, Warfronts, check it out after you finish this video, of course. Also visit our website. Why not? This transformation really took off when European police cracked the encrypted communication network EncroChat, which had long been used by organized crime across the continent. In Sweden, this led to over 400 arrests, including most of the established gang leadership, the biker gangs, the Balkan networks, established crime families. They all went to jail en masse. And you might be thinking, fantastic, mission accomplished, woo, yay! Well, no, not really. Rather than solving all of the problems, their removal created a power vacuum in organized crime circles. The hierarchical structure that had kept violence relatively contained, well, it just collapsed all at once. In its place came dozens of micro gangs, some of which were so small they didn't even consider themselves as being particularly organized, just a group of teenagers from the same housing project fighting for territory, status, and money without any of the old restraints. Now look, we're not saying that putting those old gang leaders behind bars was a mistake. In all likelihood, crime still would have surged even if they had remained free and in charge of their local organizations. But the timing was really unfortunate, and the numbers tell the story. Sweden recorded just 17 gun deaths in 2012. A decade later, that figure had risen to 62. September 2023 alone saw 11 fatal shootings, making it the deadliest month in 4 years. Now look, to be clear, this is absolutely nothing compared to the gun violence seen in the United States. Sweden's entire year of gun deaths in 2023 would represent a day and a half of gun violence in America, where roughly 130 people die from gunshots daily. Chicago alone, with a quarter of Sweden's population, sees more gun murders in 2 months than Sweden does in a typical year in 2020.
Yeah, but again, America has a huge problem. Way worse, as just said. The thing is that it's more surprising in Sweden, you know? And so I don't want to make it seem like my judgments or thoughts here make it seem like I'm like saying like, oh, you're like America. Of course you're not. But it's just the fact that you were so different a decade ago that makes it more glaring, you know?
The deadliest modern year, Sweden's homicide rate was a mere 1.2 per 100,000. That's lower than the rate in Canada, in El Salvador under the new state of exception, and way lower than in the United States. Statistically, it is far more dangerous to live in an average American city than it is to live in Stockholm. Yet that doesn't mean that we wave away what has happened in Sweden. For a country that once prided itself on being among the world's safest, where gun violence was virtually unknown, the recent transformation has been seismic. But
it's like America is like the student in class. I hope this isn't a weird that like he gets a. I wasn't great in school. I was like a C student, right? And if I get another few C's, it wouldn't be that glaring. But if a straight A student, like a lot of people see the Nordic countries, now all of a sudden start to get C's, then it becomes worrying. And that isn't to say, well, the person who got C's all the time is still getting C's. Well, yeah, but you always got A's. So what's going on, you know?
Raw statistics.
I hope you guys understand that and know that I know that, you know?
The recent transformation has been seismic, but the raw statistics don't capture the human tragedy behind the violence. Many of these deaths weren't seasoned, hardened criminals who knew their profession came with the chance of dying in a gang shooting. Rather, many of these cases were of teenagers, some on the very young side shooting at each other. Ahmed Abeid was 16 when he was gunned down at a bus stop in Malmo in 2017, just waiting for a ride died like any other day. Then, in 2021, Sweden watched in horror as Niels Eingar Gromberg, 19 years old, was executed in what reports called a gang-related killing. By 2025, gunmen were walking into Uppsala hair salon in broad daylight, killing 15-year-old Ehm Ahmed and 16-year-old Omar Jibril. The country had become a place where teenagers dying in public over drug territory disputes were all too common. What made this violence sustainable was the massive criminal economy underlying it. The Swedish drug market, estimated at over 10 billion kroner annually, provided the economic foundation. Cocaine use among middle-class Swedes had been rising for years, and the country also served as a transit point for drugs heading both to Finland and Russia. The police identified 36 clan-based criminal networks operating across the country, each controlling different neighborhoods and drug lines. Money laundering ran through seemingly legitimate businesses, pizza shops, hair salons, barbershops, all the classics of organized crime. But the Swedish gangs also added their own innovations: cryptocurrency exchanges, online gambling sites, and even legitimate construction companies that could launder millions while actually building things. The sophistication varied wildly. Some operations were run by teenagers who learned about Bitcoin on YouTube. Others involved accountants and lawyers who'd crossed over from the legitimate world, like the unholy Volvo-driving love children of Saul Goodman and the Swedish chef. Now, the recruitment pipeline started younger and younger. By 2023, police were arresting 12-year-olds for serving as lookouts, 13-year-olds for moving drugs, and 14-year-olds for shootings. This was no coincidence. The gangs had figured out that Swedish law treated minors with considerable leniency. While it's common throughout much of the world to try minors in less harsh ways than older counterparts, Sweden took it to a whole new level. A child under 15 couldn't be prosecuted at all, and those under 18 faced minimal consequences, even for very serious crimes, including murder. While passed with noble intentions of preventing kids from wrecking their lives.
Yeah, that's the problem, is initial noble intentions. That doesn't mean to let go of nobility, but you need to recognize that you can't just make yourself feel good at the expense of these people you're trying to protect. Are actually hurting them.
Through petty crimes that would follow them into adulthood. It also created an incredibly perverse incentive structure where gang leaders actively recruited children, knowing that they would face little punishment if caught. Sweden's criminal responsibility age of 15 stood in stark contrast to other European countries. While Germany was only a year younger at 14, the Netherlands was at 12, and the UK was all the way down at 10. Yet even for those between 15 and 18, prosecution was incredibly light if they were caught. A murder conviction carried a maximum of 4 years in a youth facility, which gang members described as summer camps with playstations. One imprisoned gang leader bragged that he could run his operation more effectively from inside than outside, with better access to vulnerable recruits and no risk of being shot by rivals. It may not quite be true that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but in Sweden's case, they're at the very least responsible for highway maintenance. Even for kids, the economic pool was strong. A 15-year-old could make tens of thousands kroner monthly, and they're not exactly declaring that as taxable income. Compare that to the 8,000 kroner they might earn at McDonald's, assuming they could even get hired there with limited Swedish linguistic skills and at such an early age. For a shooting, the price varied. 50,000 kroner to wound someone, 100,000 to kill. Zone was violence.
Okay, I'm already going to 40 minutes here. If you guys want me to react to the rest, I can do that. I want to see, but I don't want to obscure some of my points that I'm curious about thoughts of, just to finish the video that has 11 minutes left, and I'm sure I'm going to turn that into 20 minutes, and then it's an hour-long reaction here. If you really want to see my reaction to the rest, I'll watch the rest in another reaction, okay? At the end of the day, there is the options of either being racist or letting anyone in no matter what are not the only two options. They're the fringes, the ones that crazy people promote and are the loudest. But if you really want, again, I'm one person. I worry about portraying myself as if I know the answer. I don't know the answer. I'm giving my thoughts, all right? I believe that if you want what's truly good for people, then there has to be a balance between not discriminating, but also not allowing an atmosphere to where you're giving hopelessness. And then if you give that hopelessness, then you're giving more fuel to the people who are just going to say, well, 10 years down the line, well, the reason for disparity is racism, or the reason for disparity is for racists saying, well, they're just not Swedish and they look different, and so that's why they're different. No, all of this stuff usually comes from people with good intentions trying to make themselves feel good in the moment and feel self-righteous without caring about the actual repercussions. So that's my thought process. Love y'all. I hope you're all doing well. Would love to hear your guys' comments, especially if you're from Sweden. If I said anything you think is wrong, just false, call me out. Absolutely. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Appreciate any comments down below. You guys are always awesome. I hope to see you next time. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.